It is Monday, February. How hard is it to say February? February 1st, 2021. Apparently it's very hard for me. I'm Pastor Thor Ramsey with Center Church. This is Gospel for Five, where we take 5 minutes out of our day and focus on Jesus, because Jesus is the gospel. So we've been going through Galatians. We're in chapter 6 right now. I wanted to focus on this verse for we have 5 minutes. Let's do that. I'll focus on it for 5 minutes. But let me begin at verse 1. And brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something, when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. So what's he getting at here, really? Well, I think it's in Romans. Is it 12? Well, somewhere in Romans, I think it's chapter 12. The Apostle Paul says, don't think more highly of yourself than you should, but judge yourself with righteous judgment. So you have to evaluate yourself correctly, and that's really what this is getting at here. But let each one test his own work. So the point there is, don't be comparing yourself to others and comparing your work in the Lord, your Christian walk, to their Christian walk. That's not how we do these things. It reminds me of the gospel story where I think is it Peter? It might be Peter and John. I think that's who it is, but whoever the disciples are, I'm pretty sure it's Peter and John, but you can correct me on that if it's not. But they're walking, and one of the disciples says to Jesus, "What about him?" Meaning, what about this other disciple? And Jesus says, "What's that matter to you? If I decide that he's going to remain until I return, what's that to you? You follow me." It's the same idea here. It's like, don't worry about others in the terms of, don't compare yourself, because clearly we should worry about others, because otherwise, we wouldn't be restoring people in a spirit of gentleness. But don't compare your spiritual life, your spiritual walk, to the spiritual walk of others, because God has different reasons for using people in different ways. The point is this: evaluate yourself honestly, but let each one test his own work. So you ask yourself, is what I'm doing for Christ effective for Christ? Am I being effective? Is God using me effectively? God would use, if God's using you, it's going to be effective, but is the Lord using me? So that's the question. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself. Not that we're boasting in ourselves. The point is this, that we're not comparing ourselves to others. You can be content with how God has decided to use you for the sake of his gospel, for the sake of his kingdom. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. So it has to do with comparison. It's like, well, look at Bill. God uses Bill in this particular way. So you're boasting in someone else rather than just being concerned about, what does that matter to you? What the Lord's doing with Bill. Jesus says, you follow me. I wish I knew where that story was in the Gospels. I think it's Peter and John. I think it's in the Gospel of John, if I'm not mistaken, but it just came to mind. For each will have to bear his own load or his own burden. So we've all been given a particular, in one sense, there is this aspect to life that's bittersweet. We have this sweetness in life because we know Christ, we know the truth, we know God is ever forgiving of us because of Christ. So when we really land on that in the gospel, life is sweet. And yet that's why life is bittersweet. There's that aspect to life that just is there. And it's bittersweet because we're still in this fallen world, dealing with our sinfulness. And even with all the joy, there's still this, that's the reality that we live in right now. So we each have an aspect of that in life to bear, according to God's plan, right? But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor, for each will have to bear his own load. God has a way that he's using each one of us. So we shouldn't compare ourselves to others and how God is using them, but evaluate your own spiritual life properly and how God is using you. Now, what has God said